Hi. So in our last discussion on sexual selection, we looked at a bunch of cases where there was male-male competition for access towards the female, or the females were choosing for reasons that was pretty obvious what benefits the females were getting. And then we talked about a bunch of observations related to sexual selection, particularly where, let's say, the males were dancing or where they had some very showy organs with no apparent purpose. And in all those cases, it did not seem that those flashy organs or those dances were providing any kind of benefit to the female. And therefore, the question was that why exactly were the females choosing them? I mean, because we know that the choice is there. The females do prefer the showier, or the males with more showy organs or more showy dance and so on. So the question was, what exactly is the female trying to choose? Now obviously we said that there are no direct benefits. So that implies that there are probably some kinds of indirect benefits to female fitness, because if there are no indirect benefits, it is very hard to see why the trait is still staying in the population. And one kind of indirect benefit that can be there is in terms of improving the fitness of the offspring. But how exactly can that happen? What kind of mechanisms will lead such a thing to happen? So it turns out that there are several hypotheses that have been proposed over time. Many of these hypotheses have some empirical validation. We are going to talk about many of those validations. But at the same time, there are many kinds of controversies that also exist in the context of many of those hypotheses. We won't really get into the controversies, but we are going to briefly just touch upon a few things that don't make sense in the context of some of those hypotheses. So the first thing is, the first hypothesis or first possible mechanism can be in terms of sensory bias of females. So what it is? This suggests that the females, they have certain sensory biases, physiological sensory biases. So for example, let's say there is a female who, or females of a particular species just love red color, and that bias has come about because of some underlying physiological neurological neural reasons, but the males have then ended up evolving traits that are matching those sensory system biases. Okay. And that is what explains the entire sexual selection that we see. So do we have any evidences for this? So here is a study on male guppies in Trinidad. If you are a cricket fan, Trinidad and Tobago, you must know where it is. These are part of the Caribbean islands. So on these islands you have these streams, and in these streams you have this very famous fish known as the guppy fish. So the male guppies, they often have these orange spots that you can see over here, right? Now these orange spots, they are preferred by the females, and generally the females end up preferring the males which have the biggest orange patches. Now very interestingly, in the natural habitat of these animals, there are bright orange fruits that continuously fall into these streams from the trees. And the guppies, they also tend to eat these bright orange fruits a lot. Both the males and the females eat them. So just to see if there is a preference for color or not, what Rod et al. Did was they took discs of different colors and tossed them into fish tanks containing these guppies. And what they found was that both the males and the female guppies, they were pecking a lot more at the orange colored discs than they were pecking at any other colored discs. In other words, they had a preference for the orange color. And interestingly, this was true for both males and females. Okay, remember the females are not orange colored, they don't have the orange spots, it's only the males who have it. So, but both the males and the females are responding to the orange color, which essentially means that they are not really mistaking the disc for mates, right? Because if that were to be the case, the males would not have responded, but here both sexes were responding. Then what they did was, Rod et al., they ended up looking at multiple guppy populations and tried to quantify the amount of preference they had for these orange discs. And turns out that the average amount of attraction that is there for the orange discs, that varied across the populations. So, some populations they had greater preference for the orange discs, some populations had lower preference for the orange discs. Then what they did was, they also quantified how strongly are the females attracted towards the orange patches, and that is what we are showing you over here. On the x axis you have the this is a normalized data, which is why you are getting both minus and plus on x axis as well as y axis. So, on the x axis they are showing you the number of pecks that the females made on orange discs. So, as you go from left to right, there is a greater preference for orange discs. And on the y axis they are showing you the strength of the female preference for the orange color. And you can straight away see that there is a strong positive correlation between how much preference the female has for the orange color and how much preference it has for the orange colors on the males in terms of sexual selection. And you can straight away see that they are very strongly correlated. So, this suggests that the guppy's attraction towards the orange fruit may have driven the evolution of a sensory bias in both the males and the females, but then the males ended up exploiting this. Okay, when I say males ended up exploiting this, I do not mean that they took a conscious decision to exploit this. All that might have happened is that different males would have had orange patches of different sizes, and the males which had larger orange patches, they ended up getting more matings and therefore more reproductive success and therefore increased fitness, and that is how the trait ended up spreading in the population. So, in other words, in this particular case, the female preference is being directly driven by a simple food preference, which in turn is coming from the environment in which the females ended up growing. So, this is one way in which sexual selection could have arisen, indirect benefits. Then you have what is known as the good genes hypothesis. What does it say? It says that whenever a male is showing off by having some bright color or some large oversized organ or something, then essentially that is indicating that it has genes which is going to increase its fitness. So, in what ways? So, in terms of efficient metabolism, or in terms of how good the condition of the body is, or its ability to resist parasites or diseases, and so on. So, in those cases, the female actually does not know anything about the male, but it is simply taking those flashy organs or those dance moves or whatever as an indicator of the quality of the male. So, just to give you a empirical validation of this. So, this is work done in a 3-spined stickleback fish, and in this particular fish the males have red colored bellies and the females end up preferring the brighter red colors in the males. So, what is shown over here is the redness of the father. So, you can see the red color over here. So, how bright and how big the red patch is, and that is what is going on x axis from left to right. And there were 2 different populations, and in both these populations what the researchers did was they took the offspring from the various males and ended up asking how resistant are these to tapeworms. So, here you have offspring infected by tapeworm percentage on y axis. So, obviously the greater the percentage, the lower the resistance, and vice versa. And what you can see is a clear negative correlation for both ponds, which suggests that offspring of fathers whose feathers were, or offspring of fathers whose scales were bright red, are much more resistant to parasites compared to those offspring whose fathers had less bright red bodies. So, this suggests to you that in this particular case the female can be using the redness of the father as an indicator of how resistant it is, or as an indicator of the genes that it has to resist tapeworm infection. And of course, tapeworm infection has all kinds of implications on fitness. But in order for this entire thing to work, the signal that is being given over here in the red color in this particular case, the signal has to be true, or in other words, what is known in the literature as it has to be an honest signal. What do I mean by that? Now, suppose in this particular population of fish, suppose there is some fish which ends up evolving the red color, but that red color is not backed up by genes that provides it resistance to tapeworm infection. What will happen? The female is only looking for the red color, it is not looking for anything else. Therefore, in that case the female is going to still go on preferring the red color, and yet the ability to resist the tapeworm infection is not going to be there in the offspring, correct? So, if there is a cheater in the population which ends up giving the signal but not paying the cost in terms of having those traits for which the signal is supposed to be an indicator, then there is nothing, evolutionarily speaking, which will prevent the spread of such a cheating phenotype. So, how exactly can the signals be maintained to be honest? That is a huge question, and one answer to this comes from the Israeli biologist Amos Zahavi's so called handicap principle. So, what Zahavi says is that all these secondary sexual traits, all these feathers, colors, etc., these are known as secondary sexual traits. All these are costly handicaps, which means that they end up reducing the fitness of the males which possess them, and the fact that they are costly, that itself indicates that the males have high quality, because otherwise they could not have possessed them. In other words, if there is a very fit male which has a costly handicap, then that costly handicap, it's lowering its fitness, that's fine, but even then it still has a lot of fitness to spare. Okay, it still has a high fitness. But if you have low quality individuals, when they are trying to get that costly handicap, they cannot afford them, and that is why the presence of that signal itself guarantees, the presence of a costly signal guarantees reliability. Now, in some sense, this is analogous to a phenomena which in economics is known as conspicuous consumption. So, you know that many people, they go for luxurious goods, okay, very expensive handbags or very expensive designer clothes, etc., where it is very clear that the cost that you pay for that particular object does not reflect the manufacturing cost of that object. Yet people buy that as a show off. People buy that to signal to other people that, hey, I have these many extra amount of money to spend on these fancy clothes or these fancy accessories and so on and so forth. So, in other words, this is essentially wasting resources to prove that I have sufficient amount so that I can afford to waste. And this handicap is what guarantees that the signal that the possessor of that particular thing is giving is real. Now, this is a somewhat controversial theory, and people have written both for and against it. We are not going to go into the depth of the controversy at all, but the most important thing that I want to tell you is that This is not something that people have totally accepted in the field, but at the same time it is reasonably famous, such that most textbooks of sexual selection or evolution are actually going to talk about this theory, which is why I am mentioning it in this course. Now contrast this with another scenario which was propounded by Ronald Fisher, which actually says that it does not really matter what is the benefit of the trait. So suppose there is a sexually selected trait and there is a preference for that trait, and assume that both these things are genetically coded and they are genetically linked. So they go hand in hand. So if that be the case, then Fisher suggests that these two are going to reinforce each other, which will lead to a rapid exaggeration of the trait. And the canonical example of that is this tail of the peacock, and this particular hypothesis is also known as the sexy son hypothesis. Now how exactly does it work? I mean, as I told you, there has to be a preference, there has to be a trait that is being selected, and they have to be somehow related to each other. But then how does the entire thing work? So we will take the example of the peacock's tail and we will try to explain it in terms of the mechanisms, the underlying mechanism. So the way it works is as follows. So assume that somehow in the population there is a preference for the females to choose long-tailed males as mates. Okay. So this is right at the beginning when this thing is evolving. Right. At that point, let us assume somehow the females, let us say through some kind of a sensory bias or whatever, they have the preference for the slightly longer tails. Now if that be the case, assuming that both the preference and the long tails, both of them are genetically inherited, then the offspring that are coming out of such matings, they are going to inherit genes for both, right. Now when that happens, what is happening in the context of the male? Of course, for the male, the longer tailed males have got more matings, so there is positive selection. So obviously the number of individuals who have longer and longer tails, that is going to keep on increasing in the population. So these will keep on having mating advantages, and that is what the sexy son comes in. The sons become sexier and sexier, which means they end up getting more and more mating advantage. But what is happening to the female? Think about it. If the sons of the females are getting greater mating advantage, then that is also beneficial for the female itself, right? And therefore all those females who have a preference for the showy phenotype, the sexy sons, they are also going to be benefited because their grandsons and great grandsons are getting more and more matings. So over time the stronger preference becomes even more stronger. There is a selection for the strong preference in the females. So what is happening? The male's tail, long tail is getting selected, the female's ability or choice for that long tail or the preference for the long tail, that is also getting selected. So both the cause and the effect, both of them are getting selected in the same direction, and as a result of that there is intensification of selection on both components. And because this happens, you have what is known as a runaway evolution, which basically means that the thing just keeps on increasing in one direction without any checks. Now obviously if all this thing is happening, the population's overall fitness is decreasing. Why is that so? Because remember, the male is paying a cost for having that long tail. Okay, that cost is getting offset because it is having more mating. That is a different ball game. But overall its fitness is actually going down, and because its fitness is going down, then in the compared to the case where the females did not have such a preference, its fitness is down. But because the female has a preference, therefore the male does not have an option. It has to have the long tail because otherwise its fitness is 0 or very low. Okay. So that is why here is a situation where selection is making something increase continuously, even though on an absolute scale the fitness is going down, and this is happening because on the relative scale the males which have the longer tails, they are having a greater fitness, right. So, here I said that there is going to be runaway selection, right. In other words, the cause and the effect will keep on reinforcing each other, and therefore, both the preference and the length of the tail will keep on going up. Now, obviously, it cannot go up forever, because at some point or the other it is going to hit some kind of a roadblock. What kind of roadblock is it going to have? When there are physiological or evolutionary limits that will be reached, or if there is a balance between the gain of fitness due to sexual selection and loss of fitness due to other reasons like predation. So, what do I mean by physiological limits? Of course, there is only a hard limit on how long a tail can be, right, because at some point the feather, if they are too tall, they are going to become brittle and they are going to break, or the amount of weight that the muscles of the male bird can carry, that is also going to, at some point there will be upper limit on it. So, those are what I mean by physiological limits. What do I mean by evolutionary limits? In terms of the genes, okay, how long can you have variation at the genetic level for getting longer and longer tails? So, those are the physiological and evolutionary limits, and of course, as I said, the balance between the gain of fitness due to sexual selection and loss of fitness due to other reasons. Now, has that kind of a balance been reached at least under some situations? So, here is an empirical example to show that such a balance has indeed been reached in the context of this particular bird known as the long-tailed widow bird. So, as you can see, this is the male. As you can see, it has a very, very long tail, and you can also appreciate that when it is flying and making this display, this is creating a lot of drag, and it is kind of dragging down the flight of this particular bird. Now, what was done here? So, in this particular bird, the tails are often extremely long, more than half a meter, greater than 20, about 20 inches or so. So, what the researchers did was they created 4 groups. Okay. So, this is an absolute textbook example of high quality experimental design. So, in one case, what they did was they cut the tails of the birds. Okay. So, the tails are artificially shortened. In the other case, what they did was they lengthened the tails by taking these cut pieces and attaching it to other birds. So, these treatment B are birds whose tails are much longer than what you find normally in nature, supra long. Okay. And in this case, since you are cutting the tail, therefore, it is entirely possible that whatever results you are going to get is because of the fact that you have injured the bird in some way, or you have some way ended up mangling the bird. So, in order to control for that, what they did was they cut the tails and they attached it to the same bird. So, if there is some effect of just the cutting itself, then these birds should have a lower fitness compared to the others, and of course, they had the control, which was absolutely no manipulation. So, in this particular case, there are 2 controls. One is no manipulation control and the other is the cutting treatment control. The first thing is, and what they are trying to see is that whether if you have greater tail length or a shorter tail length, whether that ends up having a role in terms of getting chosen by the females or not. Now, the first thing is that the results from the 2 controls, they were not significantly different from each other. So, they have been put together in this particular graph. So, this is data from Anderson et al. 1982, sorry, not et al., Anderson 1982. And the first thing that this see is that when the tail is artificially shortened, then the mean number of nests per male is much lower, significantly lower compared to the controls. This is absolutely fine, because remember, there is sexual selection over here, the females prefer males with longer tails. So, obviously, if you have cut down the cut down the length of the tail, the females do not prefer those birds. But what is more interesting is this case. So, here you have tails which are way longer than what they are found naturally, and in this particular case you can see that the females have a much greater preference for this particular supernormally long tailed birds. So, this suggests that the female's preference for this longer and longer tails still exists, yet the male bird is not able to evolve tails any longer. So, the male bird has kind of stopped over here simply because some kind of a balance has been reached between sexual selection and natural selection. Now, whether this balance is because of predation pressure or whether this balance is because genetic variation does not exist anymore, we do not know that part. But what we really know is that if the females are presented with even longer tails, they will be happier to mate with them, suggesting that an equilibrium has been reached. So, the main point with runaway selection is that although the explanatory power of this is very good, unfortunately nobody has really observed a runaway selection, because a runaway selection is a co-evolutionary process. So, in order to show that it is happening, you need to be able to observe the entire sequence in front of your own eyes, and that is very difficult. So, while this is in terms of the theory it is perfectly fine, and in principle it can explain many cases like the peacock's tail or the widow bird's tail or many other stuffs, we really do not have conclusive evidence showing that it is runaway selection which has done this. Now, till this point, whatever we were talking about was in terms of getting access to mates, okay, pre-mating stuff. But that does not mean that sexual selection stops at the pre-mating stage. Sexual selection, very interestingly, can also happen during the post-mating stage. Now, how does that happen? Now, remember, in many cases, the females are actually mating with multiple males, right? Therefore, in the reproductive tract of the females, you very often have sperms from multiple males. And the moment you have sperms from multiple males in the reproductive tracts, there can be many ways in which there can be a competition between these sperms to fertilize the eggs. Remember, end of the day, one sperm is going to fertilize the egg, right? So, if there are many sperms, there is going to be a lot of competition between the sperms themselves. And this competition is what is known as sperm competition. So, there are multiple ways in which sperm competition can and does take place. So, I will show you 4 major examples and discuss what exactly happens in them. So, the first example that we have is the phenomena of sperm scooping. So, what I am showing you over here are damselflies. So, this black thing over here, this is the male. The golden thing over here, this is the female. So, this is a particular species which are known as copper demoiselles, and you can see the copper colored wing of the female. So, in this case, what happens is that multiple matings are possible. So, the male on its penis has these horn shaped structures, right? These are known as lateral horns. And when the male mates, as it is doing over here, what it does is, using these horns, it first scoops out the sperms that have been deposited by the previous male and then injects its own sperms into the female's tract, obviously thereby increasing the chances of its sperms to fertilize the female or fertilize the egg. The second example is what is known as mating plugs. So, here we have something known as the Richardson's ground squirrels. These are very large size squirrels you find typically in North America. And in this species, once the male has mated with the female, what it does is it actually inserts a glue-like object which seals the vaginal opening of the female. So, I do not know if you can see it over here, but there is a glue like plug over here. Okay, that is the stuff we are talking about. Now, of course, this is not a permanent sealing. The female can expel this plug after a little time, because otherwise the female will not be able to mate ever again, right. That does not happen. The female can expel it after some time. But the point is that while the plug is on, another mating will not happen, and therefore the sperms of this male is going to get a head start in terms of travelling down the reproductive tract of the female and fertilizing the egg. So, that head start is all that matters, and therefore, this is a direct benefit that the male gets by simply gluing shut the female's vaginal opening. The third example, so this particular phenomenon that I talked about, this is not limited only to the ground squirrel, it is actually pretty prevalent in multiple species of mammals, reptiles, insects, spiders, etc. The third phenomena is what is known as mate guarding. Okay. Female wants to mate with multiple males, I mate, I guard my female. I make sure that the female is not able to mate with anybody else. So, what I am showing you over here is this phenomena in these insects known as darters. So, this is a particular red veined darter, this is the scientific name. So, this is the male, this is the female, mating has happened, and after the mating has happened, the male is not letting the female go. It is simply clasping the female behind its neck and is forcing it not to mate with other females, other males. Okay. Now, again, this particular phenomena of mate guarding is extremely common, and you find it across species in insects, fishes, lizards, birds, and of course primates, right. And the fourth example that we have, it is a very interesting example. So, till now what we saw was essentially a lot of conflict happening at the level of the organism itself. Okay. So, now we are talking about the fact about the sperms competing directly with each other, right. Now, one thing I forgot to mention over here, that when a male copulates with a female, in many species there are all kinds of chemicals that it injects along with the sperm, and these chemicals can do all kinds of stuff to the female. So, for example, it can make the female recalcitrant to further mating, it will increase its refractory period to get the other mating, or it can do several other kinds of damages. But what I am going to talk over here is a fascinating example where there is a cooperation between sperms in this species known as the eastern deer mouse. So, this is a highly promiscuous species, lots of matings happening, and in this species it is known that when the sperms are swimming in the female's reproductive tract, if they swim singly then they can go slow, but if they form aggregates, then these aggregates and these clumps can actually swim faster. Okay. So, there is sperm cooperation that happens, so that the sperms they end up clumping together and thereby swimming faster, and once they reach there they will fertilize. But now we have a problem. If you have only one male putting its sperm inside this female, then this is not an issue, because all the sperms are after all from the same male, the sperms are cooperating, and therefore after they reach there, anyone fertilizes the egg, it does not really matter, some sperm from that male has fertilized. But suppose, because this is a promiscuous species, suppose there are sperms from multiple males inside the same female, then what will happen? So, this is what was studied by Fisher and Hoekstra 2010. So, what they did was they took sperms from two different males of the same species, okay, and then they just colored them using different colored dyes, and they put them together and tried to see what happens, and this is what they found. So, you remember I told you that the sperms aggregate so that they can swim faster. So, that is what you are seeing, aggregations. But look what is happening. The red sperms which are from one male, they are all aggregating with each other, and the green sperms which are from another male, they are all aggregating with each other. In other words, the sperms from the same male, they are preferentially aggregating rather than aggregating with sperms from a different male. So, you have competition happening across two males in the forms of their sperms aggregating with each other inside the reproductive tract of the deer mouse, right. This is absolutely mind boggling, but this is one of the several other mind boggling things that we could have talked about. So, before we finish this discussion, that is one remark that I need to make, that what we talked about in the previous discussion and this is a very, very small portion of what is known, understood about sexual selection, its direct benefits, indirect benefits, etc., etc. We just dealt with 4 of the more well known theories of sexual selection indirect benefits, but trust me, there are many, many more. The other thing that we absolutely didn't look at is the maths behind all that. So, I presented all these things as just stories, narratives, possibilities, but remember ecology and evolution are amongst the most highly formalized subdisciplines of biology, and there is a lot of maths behind each one of them. We haven't looked at any of it simply because this is an introductory course, but people who are more into the theory part of biology, I urge you to have a look at the theory behind these stuffs. They are often extremely interesting and gives superb insights. There are several other topics which are typically considered in the context of sex. So, for example, the evolution of sex ratios. Why is it that sex ratios are typically 1:1 across most species that we are aware of? Then there is something known as intralocus conflict. Remember, I told you that the same gene sometimes has to pass through the female's body, sometimes has to pass through the male's body, and something that is good while it is a part of the male may not be good while the same gene is part of a female. So, there is a conflict right at that level. That is what is known as intralocus conflict. We did not discuss about that. And of course, fascinating stuff is about mating systems. There are some organisms which are polygamous, multiple females, polyandrous, multiple males. Okay. So, why is it that all these various mating systems have evolved? What are the benefits of those things? None of this we have discussed. That is primarily because, again, A, we lack time, and B, this is an introductory course and therefore there are other interesting things to discuss. But all that I want to tell you is that sex is a seriously vast topic in evolutionary biology, and it ends up explaining an enormous number of observations. If you want to do a full justice to it, you need to actually give a separate course on that topic itself. However, there are certain cases where the individuals, as far as we can see, are not even getting benefit related to reproduction. Okay, they are not getting benefit directly, they are not getting any benefit in the context of reproduction either. So, that means that there is no sexual selection happening. So, one such case, for example, is the behavior where bees, they go and sting intruders, and you know that whenever a bee stings an intruder, it leaves its sting inside the body of the intruder, and therefore in the process it dies. Why? Because when the bee flies away, the sting is inside the body of the intruder. So, the sting is attached to the internal organs of the bee. So, when it flies away, its entire belly is ripped off, and that thing remains inside the body of the intruder. So, this bee is going to die anyway after a few minutes, right. So, it is basically committing suicide. So, this is not something that you can explain either through natural selection or through sexual selection. There is some other stuff that is needed to explain this, and that other stuff is what we are going to explain or discuss about in our next module. See you in the next week.